Here we go. Welcome to this evening's conversation. Tonight we're going to be focusing on two topics. The first conversation we're going to have is using the Leading Early Childhood Learning Community executive summary article titled What Principals Should Know and Be Able to Do. And this was produced by the National Association for Elementary School Principals, and the article kind of outlines some key standards that we should keep in mind as a principal. So I think we're going to start our conversation just speaking about maybe one or two of those standards that spoke to us and just maybe the challenges we see as a leader trying to implement or just ensure we're meeting the needs of this really important component to every school district in the early childhood student population. Does anybody want to take a stab at starting this?
I can start. One of the standards that I kind of noted that I thought kind of struck a chord with me was actually standard 1, and specifically the I don't think like the embracing early childhood learning as a whole wasn't something that like the standard as a whole was fine, but there was one area that I thought would definitely be something to work on, and that is the third paragraph, that in schools that cultivate this continuum of learning, early childhood educators are respected for what they offer their peers in later grades. And I think that kind of thinking about early childhood teachers oftentimes are kind of, they're lumped in a group of non-classroom teachers, and so they're oftentimes not seen as for full professionals in a way. And I thought that was really kind of an interesting thing about like establishing a culture where if you do have early childhood educators in your building, how you really need to work on building those connections so that primary, our 1-2 teachers, or even then our 3, 4, 5 can really see the benefits of the work that their colleagues in the preschool or the early childhood is adding to student achievement. So I thought that was kind of an interesting piece.
And also, along those lines, in Bloomington, the early childhood teachers aren't on a teacher contract. They're hourly employees. So just the sentiment in the district is that they're not as valuable. They're not.
They don't come to contract negotiations.
Right. So, yeah, it's kind of a bummer. And I think if we're going to treat them respectfully in that regard, they would need to be paid the same as regular classroom teachers.
Later on it talks about that, or was it earlier on in that article, it talks about how they need to be paid well as actual teachers. Yeah. I think that was a good point though, Rachel, because I know, especially as a math teacher right now, that's one thing that always, for math, since it is so linear oftentimes, when you don't have that communication with earlier grades, especially very foundational skills that kids should be learning, that really kind of breaks down math lessons real quickly if you don't have that.
Yeah. I think it's so easy to forget if you're not. I mean, as a middle school, I'm always amazed when I see my students who are juniors, and I'm like, gosh, they figured it out. It's like, wow, they're high functioning, having great conversations. They're adults, and I think sometimes we forget. We forget all the work that these early childhood teachers, I mean, they play a huge role in zipping up jackets, tying shoes. I mean, those things that you just kind of forget. That, I mean, when I did an early childhood practicum, we like practiced walking in a line and washing our hands, and to me it was like, wow, I forget that, like, I'm in a middle school, these things just happen automatically, but you forget that these are really important skills that students are learning in a structured setting. So for me, when I was thinking as a leadership lens, and how do you create the connection from this early childhood throughout, if you're a leader at a higher grade and not necessarily at elementary school, how do you value and really work to incorporate the skills that, and they really play an important part in these students' development, yet by the time these students get to 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, they're like, it's not like I'm thinking about early childhood teachers and the role they've played. I'm lucky if I have conversations with their 6th grade teachers. So, yeah, being really conscious as a leader I think that's what I was thinking is like, how do you place value and really just, I guess, building off what you and Rachel and Sarah, what you both addressed, is how do you treat them as these professional equals that are playing this vital role and not just these glorified daycares, because that's certainly not what they're doing.
Exactly. I have teach preschool for many years prior to this, and people would ask, well, what do you teach them? Like, what do you teach kids? And having that opportunity to say, preschool is the building block of a student's education. So by saying that and realizing how important early childhood is, there are so many principals out there that don't feel that way, that they're just taking up space in their building and they're just there. So that's pretty amazing that there's an awareness going on. So
I think it's interesting some of Governor Dayton's proposals right now with early childhood and some of the things that may come out of that. You know, like perhaps not intended, but that, you know, if more emphasis and more funding is put on early childhood, will that raise the, you know, the stature in the sense of early childhood, you know, teachers. So that's kind of interesting to keep an eye on what's happening with that.
Yeah, and NPR today there was a statistic of, like, it was like 15% of eligible Minnesota preschool aged kids, age 4, attend preschool. 15%.
Which percent? 15%.
15.
Wow.
And when I did my research last semester on community schools and preschool, it was like 5% of eligible kids are and it's not a direct statistic or perfect statistic. It's like 5% of kids are accessing Head Start that qualify, and that speaks to both our EL article and this article, where parents don't know how to access these things sometimes. They don't know what they might qualify for or what their options are. So we're missing all these kids.
And oftentimes, my sister-in-law lives in Missouri, and we're like, if this is a transient population or a population that's new to the district, I mean, from state to state, the offerings, and even from community to community, the offerings and what's available can be very different, and what you qualify for, what you have access to. So the standard that I was looking at is like that whole engagement piece, and how do you get this information and communicate what's available effectively, because clearly there's a population that maybe doesn't know about it if so few students are, families are accessing these services.
I know our district is always looking for what services we don't need to keep offering because, they aren't being accessed. And I think that engagement is important, like you just said, because once you get that engagement and people start accessing those services, all of a sudden you see that need for that service, and it makes it a lot easier for the district to hold on to and bolster services like that.
And if they're not being utilized, then maybe it's not a matter of cutting it. Maybe it's a matter of reworking it and making it so it's more accessible to families.
Easier to find on your website.
A systemic problem on our side, not on the accessor side.
Yep.
And it kind of ties in with the Immigrant article that's coming, but just like sending out a flyer isn't always the most effective way to be. Maybe you're hanging out at a barbershop or at the El Burrito Mercado or you're wherever, talking to people and communicating verbally instead of, written language. So.
Well, and I think, so the article that Rachel posted, she posted the article about how we're like the bottom rate of kids in public preschool in Minnesota, and I think sometimes I forget too that early childhood and these opportunities are one of the ways we can begin to combat the achievement gap, because most research shows that students by the age of 3 or 4 are already a standard. I mean, that's usually when they're their first standard deviation, falling below. I mean, by the age of 3 and 4, that's kind of that sweet spot of preschool and these early childhood programmings, and we're already finding that's where the achievement gap is starting. So, I think you can see a lot of connections about how you could really empower and embrace this as a tool for, starting these processes early for helping to, create equity in your schools.
I thought a lot about Standard 6, and in particular understanding the funding streams, because I think you guys know, but I do pre-K social skills for a kinder prep program 1 day a week, and they are totally funded differently. And so they're like within our building, but they're not run by their supervisor is not our principal, and just the whole how do we decrease those silos so that they feel incorporated in our schools?
Does it fall under your district umbrella?
Is it through community?
Yeah, it's community ed.
Oh.
And so you know, there aren't EL services. They don't have access to the. I mean, they use them, but not really legally, like our Spanish-speaking staff or our Somali staff. So, you know, doing the engagement piece is tough when they're not paid in the same realm. So, how do you start to have discussions to have that more grounded in the school versus just the funding source? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That's that divide between district and community ed. Like there's such a divide that it's, oh, just let community ed deal with it, but it is a district issue. It's not just, well, they're in community ed, the funding comes from them. Some of that needs to be shared with the whole so that interventions can happen. We have classrooms of 20 kids. Next fall, we have a classroom of 20 kids in our early childhood special ed program because of already been defined as that they need extra help. So getting those services to them too, it's like Sarah said, it's not that district thing, it's that funding thing. So
it's tricky.
And then that speaks to, Amanda, the ratio piece. I don't know which standard that was under, but the 15-to-1. Yep. Which I questioned. I wanted to
at the beginning of just like best practices.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I questioned that with Hattie's work. Because Hattie, his work said that class size didn't make a difference, but I wonder if it makes a greater difference if they're younger.
Might.
And then you're adding in, like Amanda, what you were just talking about, 20 special ed students. So if they're qualifying for special ed, they've got extensive needs if they're qualifying in early childhood.
Right.
So that's a
like in that class.
Just because
3 people in there at all. So
okay.
Whoever's and that early childhood special ed is paid from or for the by the district, but early childhood is community ed. So there's 2 different schools there. So then there's a whole different. You can't share resources that way either. So.
You said early childhood special ed is paid for by the district, but early childhood itself is community ed?
Yeah.
Wow.
So are these, Amanda, is this an integrated program? Are the special ed kids with the gen ed kids or not?
No. Well, at times. Some of them are, but some of them are not. The elementary school principal has hired the teacher, the para, they go out to all of the PLC type things. And then the early childhood, like we have a 3- and a 4-year-old program, they have their own PLC once a month. Completely separate, but occasionally they cross mingle because some of the kids are in there just because of spacing issues or just because of their needs have to be in mainstream as well.
Sure.
Wow.
In Bloomington.
Oh, go ahead.
No, just in Bloomington, there's a special ed preschool, but then they do free busing and free school for regular ed students so that they can have mixed classrooms. Which is just, I don't know, it'd be really, now we talk about funding, how do they do that and where is it all coming from? I have no idea. But.
So have all these students like been assessed, identified, and have IEPs that are in these 4-year-old classes?
Okay. But what is it? IFSP? Individualized Family Service Plans. So it's different.
Okay. So kind of the plan before they get to the kindergarten. Okay.
Is that like pre-special ed referral or?
Yeah. So they'll go into the regular class and then they can't cope if it's a behavioral issue, that kind of thing. Where you and I think, do they really need to be in special ed because they can't sit still and they can't, keep their hands to themselves. Is that a 3-year-old problem or is that a blood problem? So they have to kind of walk that line where put them in the mainstream preschool and then if it's in the special ed. So
I think
for sharing.
That kind of goes to standard 5, which, that using multiple assessments to strengthen learning, and really the importance of that this is formative assessment in the context of the class and not, kind of what we think of as far as standardized exams and so forth.
And I think the other thing too.
Go ahead, Ann.
No, I was going to say I think it's important too as a leader to think about how to educate maybe your kindergarten and first grade teachers about where these students are coming from, because I know our elementary schools are standard based and it's total culture shock when they get into 5th grade and all of a sudden it's straight up A, B, C, D's and F's and zeros for missing a sign. I think it's important just to have that frame then as a leader to know too, is there education or kind of consulting or work you need to do with your teachers, because that can be a huge shift if that's not the trend in kindergarten and first grade. Like, how do you open that communication and use each other as resources to, to smooth that transition from the style of learning and assessment they're doing before they might enter an elementary school where it might be different.
We create a Google Doc that we're meeting on May 6th with all the pre-K and one kindergarten teacher and the EL and me, and then we create a Google Doc and just kind of lay it out, so not more quantitative data or qualitative data on the student, and then it's really helpful for the kindergarten teachers to be able to access that the next year. So maybe something similar that you do for the middle school transition, but we do it on the earlier side. And it's amazing. You probably use that document for 2 months at the beginning of the school year, just like who's that kid and what's their story, and because they know, like, they do the home visits and they know all that stuff. That's a lot different than a kindergarten teacher has the opportunity to do. So
that's cool.
One of the interesting things, so we've been going in our district, we've been going through kind of a visioning process, and there were different groups. There was one that was early childhood, there was one that was K-5, there was a group for middle school and high school. Anyway, and kind of, and the task was to really do a lot of research around the area and best practice within that kind of, that grade band. And one of the things that the early childhood team really was reinforcing during their kind of their share out of their research was that early childhood is really up until grade 3. So there's this identification. We kind of arbitrarily put in when they reach kindergarten, then it becomes elementary. But if you look at developmentally and the research, it's really emphasizing the fact that early childhood goes through, grade 3 is essentially what they're saying. So it has significant implications for, even if there's not an early childhood program in a building that we may be leading, that it's still, many of the principles still hold true for the primary grades.
I'm looking at Standard 4 and how to ensure high quality teaching, and I just keep coming back to the thought, Sarah, that there are early childhood teachers who are just being paid hourly and are not on a contract, but then we want to be able to hire high quality teachers. Like, if my license is pre-K 3, or is that, there are people who have that license, am I right, Sarah?
yes.
Okay,
yeah.
So there's a pre-K 3 license. I wouldn't want to teach pre-K if I could teach K1, 2, or 3 on
a salary.
On the salary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, at least in Bloomington, you get penalized. Like, you're the first to get cut if you have a pre-K3 license versus a K6 license. So, like, right now we're cutting a teacher, I think this is public knowledge, but that has a pre-K3 license because she doesn't have the K6. So we're not valuing her pre-K knowledge, in our negotiations, which is interesting.
Minnesota is also, or they're looking at changing the standards for teachers. They want them to have a 4-year degree. When you look at quality teachers, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a 4-year degree. There are people out there that have associate's degrees or CDAs where they can make a developmentally appropriate classroom amazing, and that 4-year degree teacher comes in and they're completely green and they have no idea what they're doing. So really training them, urging those people to, degree or whatever, to go back to school. That's what I'm trying to do for mine. That's currently at our district. She just has her 2-year degree, and then she needs to just go back so that you can, fight for yourself if things change in our district. So.
Wow, leadership gets complex really fast, doesn't it?
I was just looking at our team, though, of us 6, and we have a really wide breadth of understanding in very different areas. Like Rachel, technology, we've got high school math and technology, middle school science, we've got community ed, early childhood and social work, and then elementary specialists. Like, the things we bring to these conversations is so interesting, and I learned so much from you guys because you just have lenses that I can't easily access. Great.
I think totally just supports and emphasizes the importance of, like, your leadership team should have these, you need to have different lenses like this. Resources you're using, whether it's staff or mentors, but yeah, I had no idea that they were paid hourly. Like,
no benefit.
And why I should have thought that there would, it would make sense that it would go through the primary years, but when it's not part of your everyday world, it's really easy not to think about those things, and then all of a sudden you lose perspective.
It shows the importance, too, of having people, on your team or that work close with you when you're a leader that don't have the same background and usually have backgrounds very different from yours. Because even reading this article and listening to you guys talk, as math teachers, high school math teachers, we want time for our students to be able to play. And I think about that and how it's tough for us, in our math curriculum meetings when we're trying to advocate for high school kids to have time to play with math. And then I read Standard 3 talking about appropriate learning environments for kids, and I think about at a pre-K level even, why would we frown on kids having time to play and not learning necessarily academic standards? So it's just the connections that I can draw from you guys and these articles that are completely out of my normal working realm are really helpful.
On that note, should we shift to the second article?
Yeah. We should, Kaya.
Good segue.
Keep us well done, people.
Okay, so for this part, we're going to look at an article called Building Partnerships with Immigrant Parents by Andrea Sobel and Eileen Gale Kugler. And this article kind of talked about the different experiences of a school with a really diverse parent population and kind of some of their key learning pieces. And so our challenge was to read this article and then maybe speak to some of the specific stories that either maybe we felt we could see echo in our own building, or maybe it might be a challenge for a young leader, or so kind of along those lines. Does anybody want to start this conversation?
Sarah touched on the one that I wanted to talk about outreach and how you can reach all parents. I look at community ed and I look at our building, and we're growing in the Hispanic population, but we have little to no resources for parents out there. Our school website just got the little toggle button for translating for, I think 1 or 2 different languages. So one of the things that I really want to focus on is getting the information out to parents in a different way, in their own language, so that they can still utilize all the services that community ed has to offer, because I think we're missing such a huge population in our town, or a growing population, just because we can't get the information out to them.
I mean, I also think that speaks to the importance of having a community liaison of some sort who understands communities that we're trying to reach, because as, 6 teachers who are all white and are, embedded in schools and understand how schools work, we need somebody who's out there who knows what can help us to reach these families, because we don't know it.
Right. Absolutely.
I don't know it.
No, and I think I was struck by when this parent was like, "Oh, that's a misunderstanding. You should just call the teacher and let the teacher."
Yes.
And the parent was like, "I didn't know I should. Like, I would never want to offend the teacher." And while I think it's great that we're informing parents that no, that's a norm. You can do that. I think it's also important that we're taking time to educate our staff at, like, make sure you are. Not to generate stereotypes or different things, but, I think it's helpful to provide education and background on it is not, if you're not hearing from a parent, it might just not be that they don't want to talk to you. Providing resources for parents and staff at how to find that happy medium of a level of engagement for both of you that's comfortable and works for the cultural norms that you're operating in.
And the norms that our school works in are not necessarily like the right norms, the good norms. Like, we're so based on, if you don't show up on time to a conference, you must not care about your kid. Well, that's might not be it at all. We just make these assumptions because we don't understand the cultural differences, and we don't ask. We don't ask the questions. So I loved it when it said that they...
Like, it's scary for me to ask. I don't want to offend them. So I don't ask. Yeah. They don't want to offend me.
I was just going to say, I think that happens a lot of times with teachers where when they aren't used to something, they don't want to offend. I mean, it's the whole Minnesota nice. Yep. I don't want to offend this parent by asking them why they didn't show up to a conference or why they didn't do that. So
it's interesting because when I taught in Japan is a culture where a parent would never contact the teacher. That would be a completely disrespectful to the teacher as a professional. And it's really interesting because I think back on my time there and how much we spend trying to connect with families, and the expectation is that the school is their professional duty is to educate my student, and we let them do their thing. We didn't, as a teacher, I never tried to contact parents. We never, nothing like that. So it was just kind of an interesting piece when it somewhere in here it was talked. I think it was in here. Oh no, it was in something else that I was reading for work, because we're doing a bunch of culturally proficient school systems training right now. But they were talking about the majority of other cultures. That is the norm, that you would not approach teachers with questions and things. That would be disrespectful. So I think that's a key piece.
I feel like my school is very similar to the school where this article was written. Can you guys hear me okay? Because I'm kind of cutting out. Yeah. Okay. So I was kind of reading it like, oh, I know this. But one thing that really struck true to me was about the leadership, and we make this assumption that there are remedial needs of the parents, if they're an immigrant, and there are some very educated immigrant parents, even in the more stereotypical, less educated groups.
Right.
So how do we promote leadership within those groups and have parent engagement strategies that meet the varied needs of those groups? And I think you kind of have to have a critical mass, but we have 50% EL, so I think we do have the critical mass. So how do we get some parents maybe more engaged with PTA versus just like, how do you do math games? Because they might be interested in more leadership, even if they have limited English skills.
Embrace that whole idea, like, knowledge is in the room. Like, the knowledge really is in our population. If we can empower them to be leaders and find the tools to support them, they can actually be great advocates for their community. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the lesson I think I was most struck by too, Sarah, was never thinking that, like, that might not engage a parent if it's always basic level, and there are many families.
Yeah, and the parent maybe has their PhD and is now a janitor or an MD, but is a janitor because that's the only job they can get,
Right.
That kind of speaks to the paragraph about personal relationships are key. And really like tapping into individuals as individuals, and finding those, I think that piece can combat a lot of the other obstacles that are in the way, when you really value an individual's experiences and find out about their experiences and use, bring them in as resource for the school.
I know in
I think the
my
other thing, oh, go ahead, Scott.
no, you're good, Sarah.
No, the other recommendation I thought was interesting was to divide it up by language group. And I think that's tricky when you have multiple language groups, and how do you make it a cohesive vision for the school? I don't know. I just think there's could be a significant conversation around that, I think.
I worry a little bit about grouping kids by language groups too. I mean, I don't know. I think it's good for all of our kids to be exposed to all of our kids, and that's we were talking earlier about having parents, involved. I think it's good for our students to be, exposed to adults who speak different languages or who struggle with English as well. Because that's not, for me, that's not where most of my students' parents come from. But I'm on a team of all white teachers, and 90% of our students are black, and I'd say probably 75% of our educational assistants in our program are black as well. And in that relationship with the parents, oftentimes we have to work with our EAs to build that relationship with the parents, because sometimes parents don't feel comfortable talking to someone who just looks so different or who has such a different background than them as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, Scott, to go off of what you were saying, that this is kind of best practice for all families, and especially the families with those who don't know how to or are not comfortable with navigating the American educational system. So this could be with our African American families, along with our EL families, and potentially other subsets of our populations that aren't accessing our educational systems, fluently, I would say.
The district, like what's good for that whole, like what Bart keeps saying, what's good for this population is usually good.
Good for everyone.
Good for everyone.
Yeah.
So I'm in a low incidence district, as it would come, as it would relate to EL students. So like this school, Sarah, your school, this system would work really well. I wonder what it would look like, or could look like, in a school where there's only, like, there are, I think at my school there are like 25 kids receiving EL services. So it's not a large enough population to have the critical mass, Sarah, that you were talking about, but it's still significant in the sense that we need these families to be connected.
Yeah, and then what can you do something more district-wide to bring that together, and what does
right,
that
but does
like?
it work? Does it work as well if it's district-wide? If what we want them to be connecting to is ours, their home school, maybe district-wide is another option, but I still feel like something needs to happen at their home school.
I think, kind of skipping, but back to what you were saying, Scott, about the EAs kind of being a bridge, and I think there's a leadership piece there. Like, that puts a lot of pressure on an EA, and in their position where they're not necessarily, not that they can't be used that way, but how do you do that and have the teacher still have, how do you teach the teacher the skills to do that versus relying on that person? Does that make sense? Like, I can see that getting a little messy. Does that gotten messy for you guys sometimes?
Well, it's kind of funny because we have great relationships with our EAs, and our EAs are phenomenal at their jobs, but our district also doesn't want EAs contacting parents because they aren't licensed professionals, whereas the teachers would love to have EAs be able to call parents after work and tell them, that, oh, so-and-so did a great job doing things. But so I think that whole giving positive feedback to parents as well, we kind of miss out on because we don't have EAs that are allowed to do that. It hasn't really gotten messy for us, though, because oftentimes our EAs will sit in on IEP meetings and they'll provide feedback, and parents know who's the teacher and who's the EA, but I think it builds that much more rapport with parents, seeing that it's not just one individual, it's a team of people that really know their child. So, I had something, though, so in my district, we have real low incidences of EL students as well. And I was talking to one of our EL specialists, and she was telling me about how a lot of our kids refuse their EL services. Is that common elsewhere?
We have families who use the EL services because they want their kids in general, especially at secondary, because they want their kids in their students to participate fully in all the other classes.
Gotcha.
How do EL services work in a high school? Do they pull them out of a full hour?
I think it's different in every school. Some are pull out, and some EL specialists will work with teachers on just kind of having teachers incorporate those services into their lessons and everything.
Yeah, we have classes that are, like depending on the level, so depending on the language level of the student. So if they're a level 1 student or a level 2 student, they're going to have more pull-out classes that are specifically EL classes. And then as they get higher, level 3, level 4, and level 5s, they'll have more and more that they're with their peers. And then some will have kind of like sheltered, so there might be a sheltered science class where it might be co-taught with a science teacher and an EL teacher. But it's interesting because it's kind of a scheduling nightmare. Trying to, like looking at it from kind of the admin side, that's a really difficult thing to find the best solution. Looking from the student side, you can say, like, for this student, this would be the best situation, but actually getting that to happen from the logistical side is oftentimes quite difficult.
And it even gets hard in the middle school because often, like, in our case, we have a lot of EL students who are really, who math is a strength, and so the scheduling of, EL for, their language support, it's really hard to, match that up so they can still be in the high-level math class. And, it's amazing how, thinking from an admin level, how conscious you have to be of all those scheduling things to ensure that all these students are getting the opportunities and, getting placed where they are challenged and getting their needs met, and not just, what works and they'll be fine type of thing. You really have to be conscious of that.
Or to always
still get electives.
Yeah, exactly. They pull them out of electives. So you got to be careful with that too, because those are oftentimes the classes where they can participate more fully.
They're the classes where there's a lot less of a language barrier because they tend to be a lot more hands-on.
Yeah.
Our EL specialists
relate with their peers,
Yep. I was going to say our EL specialist pointed me towards Richfield because they actually have a lot of their core high school classes. They have special sections that are for the level 1 and level 2 EL students. So if students are coming in, kind of late in the game or just level 1 or level 2, that they can still get some of the core content classes and make sure that those foundational skills are there so that hopefully a few years later they'll have enough of a, they'll have moved along with their language acquisition and they'll have the foundations that they are a little more successful in their later high school classes. So that was interesting.
And I think that, bringing it back to the article, that if we're not building relationships with our parents and helping them to navigate the educational language and the educational system, then they might not know to advocate for their kids in all of the contexts that we just talked about. They might be pulled from specialists and they might not get the highest level math courses or whatever courses, the highest level of rigor in a curriculum that they can be accessing because their parents just don't know.
Well, and then I can see how it might be different. You'd have to really modify it to work with your school, but I like the whole idea of a resource center and just where it wasn't really necessarily led by teachers, but it was led by a population that would maybe feel safe or be easy for everybody to access and interact with. But I just think about how complicated because in 8th grade we do the transition to high school, and thinking about here's this 100-page book of all our courses, go register and Because there are some students who aren't qualifying for EL services, but that doesn't mean their parents are, it doesn't mean that they're all going home and proficient at English at home. It's that whole, just how you really have to ensure you're creating tools and strategies for families to navigate these systems that are so second nature for so many of us. We forget that just sometimes navigating a course log and knowing if you want to take these courses, you have to make sure you do this here and here. Just how can you be creative to make sure that those resources are there and that families feel comfortable and feel like they're an easy and safe place to access and gain information.
And Anne, you said this earlier, but to not just write things off as they'll be fine. Because their parents aren't speaking up and their parents aren't in our office asking for help, so they're not being advocated for, so we have to be the advocates as the administrators and as the teachers.
Yeah, no news is not always good news.
You're right.
Right.
I posted the other article I was referring to, which is called Preparing for Culturally Responsive Teaching, but it talks a lot about the communication pieces. So I posted it in there. It's only 11 pages, so tonight, right before, because you have nothing else to do. But it's a very good article. So it's worth a skim if you do have a few minutes, because it kind of builds off the article that we read for our discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Rachel, is this something you were reading as you guys are re-looking at kind of your visioning for the school district, or did you use it?
Yeah, we're starting a pretty large initiative in kind of culturally proficient school system stuff. So right now it's a lot of foundational kind of reading and information and so forth. So yep.
Nice. So you're like a really great. You're clutch. You're gonna have all these great resources for us.
Yeah, next year. But, any other thoughts on the article as we wrap up in the next few minutes here?
No, I think we kind of maybe had my favorite thought when we kind of wrapped up the other article, just talking about how important it is to have, teammates and supporters and mentors with different lenses, so you're always keeping all these perspectives as part of your frame of reference when you're making decisions and planning and scheduling and making financial choices. It's just really important that you're thinking big picture and not getting stuck in your safe zone.
We had one issue.
Yeah, I always think of Team of Rivals. Have you read Team of? I haven't read it. My husband reads historical books, but Team of Rivals is about how Lincoln put himself with all these people that disagreed with him and challenged his thinking, and how
I haven't read it, but
don't want to hear those voices. Yeah, and you don't want to hear those voices sometimes, but you gotta hear those voices so that you can address them well and with I love, as much as that class kind of was difficult or more out of my comfort level, the policy class with the PELP framework, like it always comes back to that, who are all the different stakeholders and what are their perspectives on things. I think that's so crucial.
Yeah. I think too often administration gets kind of, they do a lot of ass kissing, and they don't ever stick their ground and really stick to their values. And if you know a lot about EL, then you have a duty to make sure the people that are making decisions are making decisions that benefit your kids and don't hinder them even further. So.
Well, and as I was reading this article, when I did my EL interview, I was working with one of the EL leaders in one of the western suburbs, and we just talk about how important it is as an administrator to have relationships with your EL staff and your special education staff, because they are your resource. And so you really need to be, she said, you just need to be in constant conversation. It can't be like a monthly check-in, but these are decisions that are probably being made all the time, and how important it is that you build those foundations and those relationships, because they are your resources. And I was like, it's a good point. You can't just you can't just pop in and say hi every month. It is important that you're using, like Scott said, if they are the resource of your building, then you're finding ways to tap into it.
I think that's a good point, though, too, that it's not, okay, here's my monthly check-in, that it's got to be an ongoing conversation that you're always talking to this person, you know, daily, weekly. It's not I'm going to get my EL update this month.
So that's my question lately is how do you have that ongoing conversation and leadership and create time for that? Because I think you get in your day-to-day and how you don't want to be in meetings all the time, but you almost have to have a weekly meeting, even if it's 10 minutes just to touch base and say, okay, what do I need to know? Or what am I missing? Or I don't know. I don't know how you do that. Like when you guys think about yourselves being maybe future principals, how will you get that information from all those different people?
It's interesting. One of the elementary principals that I'm going to work with this summer, and like she is just constantly in classrooms, before classes, after class. You know, when kids go home. I mean, just talking to people. It's not about scheduling meetings. It's just about she is a very visible part of the day. And so those impromptu conversations happen all the time, and that's, you know, like she's just some of the early conversations I've had with her, those by far are the most important, and she said oftentimes those are the things that we easily push aside because there's other things that are more pressing. So she's like, it's all about constantly prioritizing that time.
I think that too builds that relationship with those people, and then they feel comfortable coming to you and talking to you about things.
Right.
Because I think about, as a teacher, there are administrators that I don't feel going to talk to if I have a concern, because I know that I'm not a priority of theirs, that they'll just kind of brush it off. They won't actually listen to the concern, whereas there's other administrators that will listen to me and they'll explain why they did something, so that maybe that's all I needed to understand that this is how it's got to be, or maybe they'll listen with the intent of maybe it's something new to them that they can impact and change. So
I look at the elementary school principal that I work with in the building, and he's visible, and he has impromptu conversations. We can have those further things that come up that I can ask a quick question, but my director is not visible, and so some of those conversations that I probably have with her, I have more with him just to bounce ideas off of that way. I want to be like him and visible and make sure that they can come talk to me. So.
All right. Well, are we a wrap here?
We are a wrap, people.
Can I ask one question after we go off live?
Yes.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I think we're done, Scott.
all right.
Signing out, our third broadcast.
Thank you.